Smith Wigglesworth remains one of the most controversial figures of early Pentecostal history. A plumber by trade and largely self-taught in the ministry, he rose to prominence as an evangelist whose meetings were marked by dramatic claims of healing, deliverance, and even the raising of the dead. To many, he was a living example of simple faith, a man convinced that God would do what he promised without hesitation or compromise. His life and ministry had a profound influence on Pentecostal and later Charismatic traditions, shaping their emphasis on the miraculous as evidence of authentic faith rather than simply believing in Jesus Christ for salvation by grace through faith, as stated in Ephesians 2. But behind the legend lies a more complicated story. Much of what is said about Wigglesworth and his alleged miraculous ministry comes from second-hand accounts, often repeated years after the fact, leaving historians with more testimony than tangible proof. His methods were unorthodox and extreme, often physically assaulting the sick in the name of healing, rejecting medical treatment in favor of prayer alone, and dismissing theological study as unnecessary. These practices, while celebrated by followers, reveal a troubling side, an authoritarian approach to faith that could place believers at risk. Why do leaders of the Charismatic movement and the New Apostolic Reformation still elevate Smith Wigglesworth as a so-called God's general? Why was Wigglesworth's mantle passed down to William Branham, a Baptist minister, through leaders of what was to become the United Pentecostal Church? To find out, we must first examine the little-known connection of Branhamism to early Pentecostalism. Before William Branham emerged as a celebrated revivalist in 1947, his early ministry was closely tied to Roy E. Davis, a figure whose background casts a long shadow over Branham's later reputation. Davis was a controversial Pentecostal and Baptist minister, convicted of serious crimes and implicated in extremist organizations, including the Ku Klux Klan. It was under Davis's influence and ordination in the Pentecostal Baptist Church of God, a sect he had founded, that Branham first received ministerial credentials and began shaping his identity as a preacher. However, before 1947, Branham was relatively unknown and was but one of many evangelists attempting to create a name for himself in the developing healing revival circuits. In his 1945 pamphlet, I Was Not Disobedient to the Heavenly Vision, Branham recounted a series of early attempts at a healing revival ministry that suggest more failure than triumph. He described efforts to maintain the congregation in Jeffersonville, Indiana, after Davis was extradited on charges ranging from sex crimes to grand theft, yet by his own testimony, those early attempts faltered, leaving him discouraged and unsure of his calling. According to Branham, God had revealed to him by vision that is your tabernacle, and they won't eat the bread of life anymore. I am sending you westward. Later versions of Branham's stage persona would revise his alleged prophetic history to erase this chapter of his life and remove evidence of these failed attempts from his legend that later developed. The full agenda behind Davis's Pentecostal Baptist Church of God sect in Indiana is unclear. He had a history of leading multiple white supremacist groups, including the very militant Knights of the Flaming Sword, which appears to have been named in response to Indiana's black Pentecostal leader G.T. Haywood's popular tract called Victim of the Flaming Sword. Haywood's interracial movement had swept through the nation, leaving a path of interracial congregations in its wake. Even within Pentecostalism, Haywood's leadership in the movement presented a problem. Especially in the southern states, black leadership was frowned upon. As a result, the Pentecostal Assemblies of the World, or PAW, never joined the UPCI. Even though it was the original Oneness Pentecostal organization, many white ministers withdrew from the PAW, and it became primarily an African-American body of Pentecostals, Haywood being the most prominent. Yet during Branham's years as a bishop under the leadership of a white supremacist organization, Cincinnati's PAW leader Frank Kurtz held revivals at the Pentecostal Tabernacle in Jeffersonville. Kurtz would later become convinced to leave the group promoting racial equality to join the UPCI as Ohio's district superintendent. What is clear is that Branham and Davis had an agenda to embed themselves within Indiana Pentecostalism. After the death of Black Pentecostal leader G.T. Haywood, Midway Gospel Tabernacle minister G.B. Raw became the lead bishop of the PAW. The Midway Gospel Tabernacle was one of the most powerful and influential Pentecostal churches in the United States. Though Branham himself was a leading bishop of a Pentecostal organization with branches in several states, after hosting Pentecostal leader Frank Kurtz at his church in Jeffersonville, Branham posed as a Baptist minister who claimed to have never heard of Pentecostalism during a revival at Raw's church, and claimed that the revival was the point of conversion to Pentecostalism. In 1924, when a majority of white ministers separated from Haywood's leadership and the racially integrated Pentecostal assemblies of the world, they formed the Pentecostal Ministerial Alliance, which later became Pentecostal Church, Incorporated, or PCI. W.E. Kidson, one of William Branham's earliest campaign managers, was General Secretary of the PCI, having earlier served as Secretary-Treasurer of its precursor. Kidson's job was managerial and organizational, coordinating ministries, publishing, handling finances, and facilitating meetings. In short, he was an important operational linchpin in the PCI. Though later versions of his stage persona claimed to be illiterate, Branham was an associate editor for Kidson's Herald of Truth publication, the primary organ for the PCI. Interestingly, Kidson advertised William Branham's ministry in a column entitled The Voice of Healing. The name William Branham and Gordon Lindsay would later use to launch and advertise the ministries of countless ministers and evangelists in the healing revival. Working closely with Kidson to lead the PCI was Oakland minister Harry Morse. Morse served on the board as the missionary secretary, which at the time of its growth and development in the United States would have been for home missions rather than foreign missions. As it relates to the passing of Smith Wigglesworth's mantle to William Branham, the role of Harry Morse cannot be understated. At the same time, the impact of Branham's leadership in a Pentecostal organization led by a sexual predator, Davis, also cannot be understated. Branham had no issue with sexual misconduct among leadership, setting a precedent and standard that would plague not only the latter rain movement, but also many subsequent movements. Morse gained notoriety in the PCI for sexual misconduct involving multiple women in his Pentecostal assembly. Morse began holding private sessions with the women in his home, who reportedly were coerced into removing their clothing while Morse petted them. The victims later issued statements that Morse had caressed and kissed them, not only in his home, but also in his pastor's office at the school associated with the church. He also had made a habit of taking one of the women with him to the lake for vacation each year. Morse used his deliverance ministry theology as a defense. Morse admitted that the allegations were true, but that he was not to blame. He claimed that he was demon-possessed at the time, lured by the serpent to sexually abuse the women. However, he also claimed that he no longer had the alleged demon since he had fasted for 3 days to free the spirit. The victims who spoke out were disfellowshipped. The sexual misconduct was eventually reported to the board of the Pentecostal Ministerial Alliance and sent directly to W.E. Kidson. Morse used his position with the PCI to promote Branhamism, hosting and promoting Branham's revivals, as well as many connected Pentecostal and fundamentalist movements. Before Branham's sudden fame in late 1947, Morse connected Branham to Charles Fuller, founder of the Fuller Theological Seminary, where C. Peter Wagner and John Wimber would later teach theology to charismatics. Interestingly, Branham called Kidson and Harry Morse's wife to the stage in one of the meetings, touching her as a display of faith.
Is this Sister Morse? Yes. Would you stand up this morning? I want to show you something, friends. Let's stand right here. You don't mind. It's not making a public show for you, sister, but it's for the glory of God. Now look, friends, I want to show you something. I believe there's a woman standing in front of me. Would you tell me I'm wrong?
You don't.
I know it's a woman because I feel her. You think you could out-argue me?
No.
Huh? That's directly, I know it. That was a woman. I've got my back turned to her, but yet I know it's a woman. See? Because the sense of feeling tells me there's a woman there.
This display of feeling a woman was highly insensitive to any victims present in the audience and would have been offensive to any familiar with the nature of the sexual misconduct. Years later, Branham admitted that the passing of Smith Wigglesworth's mantle had been foretold while meeting privately in the school where Harry Morse assaulted the women. According to Branham, a prophecy originated with evangelist Charles S. Price that a great revival would be coming, and other men had visions of his ministry. Branham claimed that after Smith Wigglesworth died, and according to Pentecostal prophecy, he was given the gift of healing by an alleged angel.
How are you, Brother Mars? One, I'm so happy for you, brother. I'll never forget the little day study in your school there that you and I and Brother Kids and all of us talked on the Bible and the grace of God, and how the Dr. Price had prophesied of a great move coming. And Dr. Price moved off the earth one day, Wigglesworth moved off one night, Dr. Price the next morning, and the next day I was visited by the angel of the Lord just to go out. And man foresaw it coming, you see. And here it is now.
In Branhamism, as is the case in spiritualism, the passing of a mantle occurred through the death of a religious figure near the time of another religious figure's birth or spiritual event. This is the foundation for what would later become the grave-soaking doctrine of the NAR. Branham also suggested that he had been empowered with the so-called Elijah spirit of John Alexander Dowie, claiming that Dowie died on one day and he was born the next.
The great teacher, late Dr. Dowie, how Dr. Dowie in his death prophesied that I would come to that city 40 years from the time that he died. Not knowing nothing about it, he died on one day and I was born on the next, and 40 years to the day I entered the city, not knowing nothing about it. Oh, how God's great move is coming together.
Sadly, the unsuspecting crowds never examined the dates behind these claims. After the revival held by Harry Morse and the passing of Smith Wigglesworth's mantle to William Branham, Branham became a recognized name in the revival circuits and would eventually go on to spearhead the post-World War II healing revival. This would be one of two main catalysts for the Latter Rain revival of 1948 and the subsequent Latter Rain movement that swept through the United States and Canada through the mid-1950s. But was William Branham really empowered with the Spirit that left the deceased Smith Wigglesworth? Did the Spirit of God really pass through Branham into the many others in the long trail leading to the New Apostolic Reformation today? Some historians might argue this is the case, since the movement largely ignores the sexual misconduct of apostolic and prophetic leadership, and leaders such as Bob Jones, Paul Cain, and Todd Bentley, all who claim prophetic succession from Branham, had similar allegations or admissions of abuse. Is this trail of abuse a movement by God? Or was this all a distraction, shifting focus from sexual misconduct to a so-called move of God?